Doctor Who, The Eight Doctors, by Terrance Dicks. Prologue. The Doctor closed the time machine with a sigh. Dear old HG, he muttered. Such an optimist, such an enthusiast, especially for the ladies. The Doctor smiled briefly, as if at some pleasant memory. But then he frowned, as the recent, subjectively recent events of the Millennium celebration in San Francisco flashed through his mind in a jumble of outrageous images. It had been a weird, fantastic adventure, full of improbable, illogical events. He scowled at the memory of the Master, treating his precious TARDIS as if it were his own. How bad had he got in the first place? Where had he acquired those mysterious morphic powers that he had made use of so freely? Useless to speculate, decided the Doctor. He would probably never know the answers now. He looked around the vastness of the reconfigured TARDIS console room. With its redwood-panelled walls and complicated console, he had been so pleased with it once, now it seemed to carry the lingering tint of the Master's presence. The Doctor stood up abruptly, suddenly troubled. Better make one final check, just to make sure that none of the Master's malignant influence remained. Leaving the TARDIS console room, the Doctor made his way to the cloister room. He paced slowly along the pillared walkways and crossed the stone-flagged square, entering the massive central structure that held the Eye of Harmony. He stood gazing down at the flat granite sculpture in the shape of a great closed eye. It wasn't the Eye of Harmony at all, of course. Not really. Just a symbolic manifestation, an aspect of the great Eye of Harmony on Gallifrey. Created by Omega, stabilized by Rassilon, the eye held a trapped black hole. Its inexhaustible energy powered the whole of Gallifrey, including all the TARDISes, with which the Time Lords voyaged through space and time. Even an antiquated Type 40, like this one, was directly linked to it. The Doctor studied the eye for a moment longer. It was closed, as it should be. Everything was in order, except in the stone corner of the closed eye, something gleamed like a tear. The Doctor leaned forward to study it more closely. It was solid, like a tiny gleaming diamond. Surely it must irritate the eye, thought the Doctor, like those gritty fragments children call sleep that they sometimes find in their eyes upon awakening. He leaned in closer still. The little diamond started to blaze even more brightly. It glowed and burned and spun itself into a bolt of pure energy that lashed out and upwards and flashed into the Doctor's eyes, searing across his brain. The Doctor staggered back, his hands to his eyes, and crashed to the ground. As he fell, he heard a mocking voice. Always one less trap, Doctor. All's ill that ends ill. The Doctor spiraled down into blackness with the Master's mocking laughter ringing in his ears. Some time later, he had no idea how long, the Doctor awoke. He got to his feet and stood swaying for a moment, rubbing his eyes. He looked down uncomprehendingly at the flat stone sculpture of a closed eye, relieved when its blurred outlines focused into a sudden clarity. At least he could still see, but what was he seeing? With a sudden shock of horror and fear, he realized that his surroundings were weird, exotic, and completely strange to him. He turned and staggered away, out of the cathedral-like building, across the stone-flagged square. He had a destination. He knew that, if nothing else. Something was drawing him. There was somewhere he needed to be. His stumbling footsteps took him along a different route through the labyrinth interior of the TARDIS, ending up in a room with white, rounded walls, and a many-sided central console. This, although he didn't realize it, was the old, traditional TARDIS control room. In all its classic simplicity, a few old-fashioned chairs, a comfortable lounge, an antique table, a hat stand, a tall column with a statue of a bird on top. There was something comforting, reassuringly familiar about this room. He leaned on the control console, hands spread out flat. The console seemed to tingle with warmth. Life and strength flooded into his body. He had found an old friend. After a moment, he straightened up and looked uncomprehendingly around him. What was this place? Clearly it was some kind of control room, but what was it supposed to control? He wandered about the room, There were chairs, a table, a teapot with an unwashed mug beside it. He touched the wall, and a locker door swung wide open, revealing a rack of clothes. A man stood beside the locker, watching him. A tall, blue-eyed man with longish hair. He wore a long velvet coat, a wing collar, and a cravat. They stared at each other for a moment. The doctor raised a defensive hand, and the figure did the same. Suddenly, he realized that he was looking at himself in a full-length mirror set to the locker door. He stared curiously into the face in the mirror. It was the face of a stranger. A word formed itself in his mind. Amnesia. He didn't know what he looked like. He didn't know who he was. He felt a girl's warm lips on his own and heard a voice shout exuberantly, "I am the doctor!" The voice was his own. "Well, that's something," he murmured. A name, or at least a title, but it wasn't enough. Doctor of what? Which doctor? Doctor who? He heard another voice, but this time it wasn't his own. It was a deep, booming voice, rumbling and husky at the very same time. It called up a shadowy picture of a great vaulted chamber in which a shaft of light picked out a massive stone bier. On top of the bier lay a motionless form, dressed in ancient ceremonial robes. A frieze of Time Lord images ran around the sides of the bier, but the eyes in the stone faces were furiously alive. The voice said, "Trust the TARDIS, Doctor." Immediately, the Doctor knew that the TARDIS was where he was. The many-sided console beneath his hands, the infinity of rooms and corridors and chambers that lay beyond it. A mini-universe. And a sentient entity. An old friend. The voice in his head spoke again. "Trust the TARDIS. Let it take you back to the beginning." The Doctor's hands began fumbling over the controls. Chapter 1. Totter's Lane. A girl skidded around the corner into Totter's Lane and sped along the rutted pavement. A thin, weary girl with blue eyes and close-cropped fair hair, wearing black jeans, white t-shirt and trainers. Samantha Jones was on the run. Still running, she glanced over her shoulder and saw a little knot of panting figures turn the corner behind her. A hoarse voice shouted, "Sam, wait up! We only want to talk!" "Huh, sure you do." She increased her pace, lengthening the gap between her and her already flagging pursuers. She grinned. Smokers, boozers, barroom cowboys. The only exercise they got was pulling the ring pull on a can of lager. Sam Jones was a runner, 3 miles every morning without fail. She could leave this lot standing. She was nearing the other end of Totter's Lane when a tall, red-haired, skinny young man in black jeans, black t-shirt, and a black padded jacket stepped in front of her. "Hello there, Sam. Going somewhere?" Sam spun on her heel and ran back the other way. Baz was alone. But even alone, Baz was a lot more scary than any of those moronic thugs he called his gang. Unfortunately, she was now running back towards those same thugs. They had strung across the road to block her escape. 3 of them. Little Mikey, Pete, and Mo. Mo was short for monster. He was as big as a gorilla, but considerably nastier. Sam took a quick look over her shoulder and saw that Baz was strolling along behind her. Baz never ran. He would have considered it uncool. Sam glanced quickly around. She was running along the side of the high wooden fence. No turn-offs in sight. But there was a gate. Midway between her 2 sets of pursuers. She sprinted up to it. The gate was locked. But it wasn't all that high. She took a few paces back, sprang forward, and swung herself over the top. Sam Jones was a gymnast as well. As she dropped to the ground, she heard the first of her pursuers crash against the locked gate. She looked around her. She was in a junkyard. An abandoned junkyard, if such a thing was possible. There was an incredible collection of odds and ends. Broken furniture, old bikes and rusty lawnmowers, faded pictures and shattered frames, shop window dummies looking eerily human. A faded sign was propped against one wall. Totter's Lane Yard. I am Foreman, Prop. Of course, Sam thought. Foreman's Yard. The place had been closed for years now. a junkyard that had been junked. It had a sinister reputation that went back over 30 years. Something about a mysteriously appearing and disappearing police box. There didn't seem to be any sign of it now, but there had been tales of people just disappearing, and about strange silvery monsters. Aliens and UFOs? In Totter's Lane? Yeah, right. Sam heard the sound of heavy bodies footing against the locked gate once more. Little Mikey was saying, "Here, Mo, give us a bunk up." It was then that she heard a strange wheezing, groaning sound from somewhere behind her. The transparent column at the centre of the TARDIS console, somehow the Doctor knew it was called the time rotor, slowed in its rise and fall, and gradually came to a halt. The Doctor also knew that this meant that the TARDIS had landed. And what did you do when the TARDIS landed? Somehow he knew that too. You went outside and took a look around. Automatically the Doctor's hand went to the control that opened the TARDIS doors. Sam spun round, and there was the police box in the corner of the yard. Old, shabby, and out of date, it fitted in quite well. But it hadn't been there a moment ago. She saw the door begin to open. A young man appeared in the doorway. He wore old-fashioned, vaguely Edwardian clothes, and he had brown curly hair and extraordinarily bright blue eyes. He stepped out of the police box and closed the door behind him. He looked at Sam and smiled. "How do you do?" Sam gaped at him. From the other side of the door, he heard Baz's voice. "Smash it open, Mo!" "But Baz, smash it open!" A massive bulk smashed against the door. The lock gave way and the gates swung open. Mo staggered through, followed by little Mikey and Pete. Seconds later, Baz strolled through behind them, Mr. Cool himself. He shoved through the group and took his rightful place in front of them. The Doctor regarded the newcomers with mild interest. "How do you do?" he asked again. Nobody replied. Sam and Baz had eyes only for each other, and it wasn't because they were in love. "I want a word with you, Sam," said Baz. "We've got nothing to talk about." "There," the Doctor said helpfully. "The young lady doesn't want to talk to you, so now you can be on your way." Baz seemed to notice the Doctor for the first time. He glanced at him briefly, then turned back to Sam. "Who is this fancy-dressed loony?" "No idea." Baz gave the Doctor his hard man glare. "Well?" "I'm the Doctor." "Shut it, or you'll need a doctor." Ignoring the dutiful laughter of his little gang, Baz returned his attention to Sam. "I want to talk to you, Sam, about talking." Talks about talks. Very diplomatic. Baz spelled things out with deliberate enjoyment. "I want to talk to you about you talking about us." Sam looked quickly around, seeking some way of escape. There wasn't one. She tried to play for time. "Sorry, Baz, you've lost me. You've been talking to the filth about me," said Baz. "You've talked about Pig Foster, shortly after which we got turned over. Luckily, I haven't picked up the gear yet." "So they didn't find anything?" Baz took a plastic shopping bag filled with smaller plastic bags out of his pocket. "Now I've got to find a new drum. A new place for my stash. And it's all your fault, Sam." The sight of the drugs made Sam too angry to be cautious. "Now listen to me, Basil. Don't call me that." Sam ignored him. "We all know you're Coal Hill School's friendly neighbourhood dope dealer. Bit of pot, E for the ravers, a few tablets of LSD. I don't like it. But that's how it is these days." She pointed to the bag in Baz's hand. "But that stuff?" "Gotta expand, Sam. This is an enterprise culture, right? Crack is the coming thing." "Not at Coal Hill. Not if I have anything to do with it." "That's just it, Sam," Baz said patiently. "You haven't. Shut up and mind your own business. If you want to stay healthy, that is." Sam was too angry to be afraid. "What are you going to do if I don't? Duff me up? Kill me? There's witnesses, remember?" Baz glanced contemptuously at the Doctor. "Think I'd worry about him? He'll shut up. Or I'll shut him up." He gave her a would-be winning smile. Anyway, you got me all wrong." "I don't want to hurt you, Sam. I like you. I really do." Sam shuddered. The awful thing was, it was actually true. Baz did seem to like her, despite the fact that she'd always stood up to him. Because of it, perhaps. So I thought of a better idea, Baz went on. And what's that? He tapped open a plastic bag. Can I give you a few free samples? What? Works very quick, this stuff, Sam. Right away you'll be feeling really high. And pretty soon you're really hooked. See, once you've tried it, you won't be so snooty about it. And you won't want to stop me no more. 'Cause I'll be your source of supply. You might even start being nice to me. Don't worry about the dosh, Sam. I'll give you a special price. After all, we are mates. Baz beamed at her, pleased that Boyd had come up with a neat solution to a tricky problem. Suddenly Sam felt sick with fear. You won't get me taking that stuff. I don't smoke. I don't even drink Coke. I'm a vegetarian. Sorry, Sam, you got no choice. Not the first time, anyway. After that, you'll like it. Baz nodded to his fascinated gang. Grab her. This won't take long. Baz's boys moved forward. Sam shrunk back towards the doctor and the TARDIS. Excuse me, said the doctor. He'd been standing there all this time like someone trapped by a baffling conversation at a party. Unable to join, but far too polite to move away. What? Snarled Baz. Let me just see if I've got this straight, said the doctor. He pointed a finger at Baz. You and your associates are engaged in the sale of illicit drugs in a school? To children? That's right, Sam said before Baz could reply. Now he's about to move on from soft drugs to hard. That stuff in the bag is crack cocaine. The doctor turned to Baz, who shrank under the freezing glare of those bright blue eyes. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? The question was obviously perfectly sincere. Baz was stung by the contempt in the doctor's voice. Look, it's just business, right? Keep out of it or you'll get hurt. Remorselessly, the doctor continued his summing up. Do I also gather that you now intend to forcibly administer drugs to this young lady so that she is unwilling or unable to hamper your activities? That's right. What are you going to do about it? I must ask you to come with me to the local authorities. He glanced inquiringly at Sam. Coal Hill Police Station, she said quickly. The doctor nodded. To accompany me to Coal Hill School Police Station, surrender those drugs and make a full confession. There was such authority in his voice that, just for a moment, Baz actually found himself moving to obey. Suddenly getting hold of himself, he turned to the largest of his gang. Mo did all the gang's heavy work. Mo would smash this prat who dared talk to him. To him, Baz, like he was dirt. Like he was nothing. Sort him, Mo. Mo rushed up, reaching out for the doctor, who stepped forward, took hold of Mo's right wrist and made a complicated-looking circular movement. Mo performed a complete somersault and landed flat on his back, all the breath knocked out of him. For a brief moment, the doctor recalled flying through the air, picking himself up and facing a many-armed, glowing-eyed being in a huge, misty cavern. Concentrate, Doctor, said the creature sternly. Remember, centering, circularity, focus, and balance. Use them to turn your attacker's strengths against them. Handicapped as you are, you should be able to do better than this. And with time and practice, he had done better, recalled the doctor. Pleased that at least one fragment of memory had been restored to him. In fact, he had become extremely adept at Venusian Aikido. Few two-armed life forms could claim as much. As Pete, little Mikey, and Baz closed in for the attack, the doctor moved gracefully amongst them, pulling here, twisting there. Amidst the yells and rage of pain, 3 bodies flew through the air in a kind of involuntary ballet, all landing on Mo, who was just struggling to get up. The doctor turned to the astonished Sam. Shouldn't you be back in school? Sam glanced at her watch. It was 11 o'clock. I suppose I should, really. Off you go, then. I can deal with these 4. You certainly can. Thanks. She looked at him for a moment. He was a very good-looking man. Pity he was balmy. With a nod of farewell, Sam slipped through the open gate and disappeared. The doctor looked at the pile of bodies, which started disentangling itself into 4 badly shaken youths. No one seemed very anxious to return to the fray. In fact, Mo was edging away, making for the exit. Before he could speak, there came the sound of a car engine. He went over and looked through the open gate. Cops! He dashed straight out of the gate and started running. They all heard the wail of a police siren. Reacting to a familiar stimulus, Baz and his boys had scrambled to their feet, dodged through the cluttered junkyard, and vanished over the back fence with amazing speed. Still feeling bemused, the doctor watched them go. Ought he try to stop them? Perhaps it was none of his business. But then, what was his business? What was he doing here anyway? As he turned to go back to the TARDIS, his foot brushed against something. It was Baz's plastic bag. He stooped down and picked it up, just as a blue-clad figure ran into the yard. A few minutes earlier, Constable Bates, who was old and cynical, and Constable Sanders, who was new and keen, turned into Totter's Lane in their area car. Bates was letting Sanders do all the driving. The experience was good for the lad. He was just about to point out that it was tea break time when a young, eagle-eyed Sanders had to go and spot some local scrote running out of Foreman's yard. "Look!" Sanders switched on the siren and put his foot on the accelerator. Bates shrugged. "Just some kids messing about." "That gate was locked yesterday," snapped Sanders. "Must be a break-in, at the very least." All right, grumbled Bates. "It's not exactly the great train robbery, is it?" By the time the police car screeched to a halt outside the junkyard, the running figure had disappeared around the corner. Sanders jumped out of the police car and ran into the yard, followed by a more leisurely paced Bates. They found an oddly dressed, long-haired man standing in front of an obsolete police box, a plastic bag in his hand. Sanders desperately wanted to whip out a magnum and scream, "Freeze, scumbag!" But that wasn't how you did it over here. Dropping a hand to his baton, he said, "May I ask what you're doing on enclosed premises, sir?" The man looked baffled. "I'm not really sure. I just sort of arrived." Bates took in the strange costume, the vague, staring blue eyes. Another one released into the community too soon, he thought. More out than in these days. "What's in the bag, sir?" presided Sanders. "Is it yours?" Now, I want a word with you about that," the doctor said. "Apparently it's something called cocaine. Crack cocaine." He gave him a reproving glare. "Were you aware that this stuff was being peddled in your area? There was nothing like this when I used to live here." At the mere mention of crack cocaine, Sanders and Bates both drew their batons. Drugs often meant guns these days, even in London. "Just hand me the bag, please," said Bates. "Yes, of course." The man handed it over. Bates looked in the bag, then turned to Sanders and nodded. "And where did you get this bag, sir?" "From a young man. He brought it here." "They must have been using this yard for a drug deal," said Sanders. "That kid I spotted was the lookout. He warned them and they all cleared off." Bates looked at the oddly dressed stranger. "This one doesn't seem to be in any hurry." Sanders didn't want to miss the credit for catching a big-time dope dealer. "We'd better take him in." "I really haven't got time to go with you now," said the man calmly. "I'm rather busy. Why don't you just take the drugs with you and I'll try and pop in later?" "I'm afraid it's not that simple, sir," said Sanders. "What's your name?" "You can call me the doctor." "Full name, please, sir?" Another dormant memory revealed. Smith. Dr. John Smith. He gave him a worried look. "I really must be off." Sanders put a hand on the man's shoulder. "John Smith, I'm arresting you for being in possession of a controlled substance. You are not obligated to say anything, but if you fail to mention anything which you later rely on in your defense, that anything that you do say may be used against you." The doctor stared at him. "What does all this mean? I don't understand." "Let me put it in layman's terms, sir," says Bates helpfully. "Doctor, you're nicked." Sam Jones slipped into the empty playground. Break was over by now, and she headed for the school buildings. She might still be in time to sneak into her next lesson. Maths with old Payne. Or maybe she'd just cut it. Her attendance record was still pretty good. Much better than what most people at Coal Hill School had. She was about to go inside when a voice behind her said, "Oi!" Sam gasped and turned around, heart thumping. She was suddenly afraid that Baz had managed to get there before her and was waiting in ambush. But it wasn't Baz. It was a stocky, fair-haired young man, in jeans and a sports jacket. He might have been one of the other pupils, but he wasn't. He was Trev Shelby, one of the younger teachers. "What have you been up to, Samantha?" Trev did his best to look stern. which wasn't easy with a round, cheerful face and a snub nose. "Nothing," said Sam. "Had to pop out during break. To quote the school rules, pupils are required to remain upon the school premises during break times. Anything in the way of popping out is strictly forbidden." I didn't have much choice. Trev Shelby looked at her. She was clearly shaken up. Much more so than was called for by being caught in a minor bit of rule breaking. She looked worried and frightened, and Samantha Jones was usually pretty cool. "What's up, Sam?" "Nothing." "Don't give me that." Sam looked round. "It's nothing, really." Trev sensed that she was uneasy in the open playground. "Come with me," he ordered. "Where?" "Staff room. It should be empty by now." But the staff room wasn't empty. Not quite. A tall young woman with black hair drawn back in a bun was sitting in the corner, marking a pile of essays. She peered over a pair of oversized glasses as Trev Shelby marched Sam inside. "What's going on?" "I've brought Samantha in for a cup of coffee and a chat. You know that's against the rules." "Tell me about it." He went to the urn in the corner and poured a lukewarm coffee for Sam and himself. "One for you, Vicky?" "Yes, I suppose so." Vicky Latimer looked at him in amused exasperation. Like Trev, she was one of the younger staff, but their temperaments were very different. Vicky was a believer in obeying rules and keeping up the standards. Hard work in present-day Coal Hill. Trev Shelby just wanted to get through the day. Or so he said. But he was a good teacher, almost in spite of himself, and he cared a lot more about the kids than he let on. "Sam's upset about something," he said. "Maybe you can get her to talk about it, Vicky? You know, girly talk." "Chauvinist oaf," said Vicky. "What's the matter, Sam? Anything you can tell us about?" "Someone giving you a hard time?" asked Trev. Sam looked from one to the other. She'd lose all her cred if anyone found out. You just didn't talk to teachers. Not about some things. But suddenly, it all seemed too much. She nodded. "Baz." Trev frowned. "Baz Bailey, the Pill King? What about him?" "He thinks I've been grassing him up." Vicky looked baffled. "Informing on him to the police," explained Trev. He turned to Sam. "Why don't you just tell him he's wrong?" "He'd never believe me." "Why not?" "Because he's quite right." "What do you mean?" "Baz is right," repeated Sam patiently. "I've been grassing him up.